A fine day to you folks. It's another bi-monthly meeting of extended family. So we wish you all wisdom and understanding from today's educational gift that we're bringing straight to your living room. We couldn't ask for anything more than you letting us into your lives. So thank you and welcome to another information gift. Welcome aboard, everybody. It's all yours, Lisa.
Hi, everyone. For those of you that don't know me, I see some familiar faces and I see some new friendly faces. I'm part of the Everything ALS team, and I'm an advocate because I lost my younger brother to ALS in 2018. So I have a call to action for everyone tonight. Please help us by subscribing to our YouTube channel and following us on social media. I manage all the social media accounts like Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook. We have a private group and a public page. So I'll post the links in the chat so you can pick one to follow, pick them all. We just want to continue to provide valuable information for everyone and keep you coming back and keep the experts coming. So on our social media, you can find out things like how to sign up for our speech project. It's the largest voice project in ALS. It's growing to 1,000 participants, and anyone 18 and over can sign up for it that has a voice and can speak. So we also give you updates on our webinars. We collaborate with others. I let you know about other organizations and their webinars. So lots of good information, even things like Rare Disease Day on the 28th, how we can spread awareness. So that's it. I just want to say hi and hope you can all follow us and subscribe to our YouTube. Thank you.
Hey guys, we're very excited tonight. I know this is a topic so many people have asked for, so we're really, really happy to have Wendy Erler here. Wendy has built her career in many rare disease communities and oncology. Erik is one of the executive directors for the Global Project team.
Thanks so much, Deb. And for all of you, thank you for joining and giving us an opportunity to spend some time with you. As Deb mentioned, I have a lot of experience working with the ALS community, and it truly, each and every one of you, we're fighting for you and with you. And I'm so privileged to have a chance to meet so many new people this evening. What really started the conversation about this webinar tonight was I was sharing with Deb and Lisa and the team the types of questions that I get asked in my role at my company around our clinical trials. And it's pretty consistent what comes in from people in the community. So we thought that we would just give a high-level overview of clinical trials generally, and then Erik's going to share with you our clinical study that is underway and provide an update and some of the rationale for why we designed the study the way we did. This is a conversation. Please interrupt me. I'm not an expert. If I don't know the answer to your questions or Erik doesn't know, we'll certainly follow up and get answers back. So don't hesitate to interrupt. So we'll start with, why clinical trials exist. And they really are in place to provide patients access to experimental therapies. And a clinical trial is a scientific research study to determine whether a new approach or treatment is safe and effective. The terms clinical trial, clinical study, and research study are fairly interchangeable, so you hear it called different things. By joining a trial, you can help move ALS disease understanding, research, and treatments forward and provide real hope for a better future. We need to get better at the clinical trials we design and execute. We've had a lot of failed studies in ALS. So we're also really committed to listening and learning from each of you to ensure we're designing the right kinds of studies. Clinical trials follow a plan known as a protocol, and the protocol is a carefully designed approach to studying this investigational medicine, and it looks at balancing the potential benefits and risks to participants while also being able to answer specific research questions. And a protocol includes several components: the goal of the study, who is eligible to take part in the trial, protections against risks to participants, details about tests, procedures, and treatments, how long the trial is expected to last, and what information will be gathered. All of this information in the protocol is reviewed high level in a very dense document called an informed consent form. The reason behind the density of the informed consent is really to ensure anybody entering a study has all of the information in advance and knows what to expect. The term that describes all of the components of a clinical trial. So the goal of the study or the purpose, who is eligible to take part, protections against risks to the participants, details about tests, procedures, and treatments, how long the trial is expected to last, and what information will be gathered. You, as a participant in a study, also are provided with what's called an informed consent form. And it's a very dense document and has a lot of what I call legalese. It's a really important document because it describes the goals of the study in more detail, as well as the expectations for participants. The trial itself is led by a physician that's called a principal investigator. And then there are members of a research team at a study center that help monitor the participants' health and determine the study's safety and effectiveness. Who should think about participating in a clinical trial? Everyone facing an ALS diagnosis should be aware of clinical trials. And the best way to know if you should consider being in a clinical trial is to talk to your doctor and treatment team. If your doctor is not involved in clinical research, you may be able to be referred to a trial center. The companies and institutions that sponsor studies, like the company that Erik and I work for, do design and organize and initiate clinical trials, but we don't actually conduct the research. That's done by the principal investigator at the treatment center. So one of the most common questions I get is people calling and asking us to sign them up for our clinical trial. And we just aren't able to do that as the study sponsor. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. At this time, most ALS studies enroll people who are early in their ALS journey, often within 2 to 3 years of diagnosis. So researching trial opportunities as soon as possible is important. Research studies are designed to provide data that informs whether a drug should ultimately be approved for wider use. So it's often very frustrating to members of the community that more people aren't eligible for a study, or that studies aren't available at sites close to them. But the truth is, most research studies are designed to attract as wide of a group of people as possible, as fast as possible, to actually execute the rigorous scientific process, ultimately with the goal of making a medicine available for wider use. Clinical trials are often open at large ALS treatment centers, and the number of study sites depends on the size of the study. For example, how many people will ultimately be enrolled. The study coordinator and physician who is conducting the trial are the ones who can enroll you in the study. How can you find out about trials? There are a couple of tools online. One is the ALS Signal tool, and they've developed a very nice clinical research dashboard that lists all of the ongoing clinical studies. Another is clinicaltrials.gov, and here you have the availability to search for ALS studies and then to open the locations tab and look at enrollment criteria, et cetera. But the best source of information is really to ask your physician and his staff for more information about clinical studies and for a referral to a trial site if needed, or you can contact the trial site directly. As I mentioned, study sponsors or the pharmaceutical companies aren't able to enroll in clinical trials, enroll people. The study sponsor may be able to point you to study sites, confirm enrollment criteria and process. You don't, however, need to send your personal health information to the study sponsor. So we receive quite a few emails asking about our study, and it often includes people's personal health history. And that's not necessary for you to share that with us. Much more important for you to share that with your healthcare provider. If you search for a clinical trial, there's certain information that will help you assess your eligibility. Details about your own diagnosis, such as time to diagnosis, genetics if available, your SVC status, your ALS FRS, and other criteria that determine trial eligibility, your current and previous treatments, knowing if your ALS center participates in clinical research or other locations where the trial is offered. You might want to ask, what is the schedule of assessments, and are they all done at the trial site, or can you visit a local site or have home visits? This helps you understand the true burden of the study and the commitment that will be involved for you and your family members. Are there any expenses you would have to incur personally, i.e. travel? What will your responsibilities be if you take part? How long are you expected to participate in the study? What is the time period once the study closed that you'd be asked to have follow-up visits, etc.? And then who will tell you about the results of the study, and how will you continue to be informed? Some study sites maintain a patient recruitment Excel tracker or some other list. I often hear from people that, XYZ site put me on their list. They do this so every time someone reaches out about a study, the personal information can be added to the tracker, and then sites, particularly those that have a lot of research interest, have this Excel tracker at their fingertips, and they can gauge quickly who might be eligible or not. What this list does not do is automatically enroll you in a study or automatically put you in line for a study. So it's one of those situations where really advocating for your own interest is going to be very important. There are many different types of clinical trials. This is an example: prevention studies, screening trials, diagnostic trials, treatment trials. Those are what we're talking about now, which test new treatments or new combinations of drugs or new approaches to surgery or radiation therapy, for example. There are behavioral trials and quality of life trials. It's important to know what type of study you are signing up for should you choose to enroll. And then clinical trials are executed in phases. And Erik will talk in a few minutes about the Alexion study and the phase of that study. Phase 1 studies are really just to ensure that a treatment is safe in humans and to determine how and where it distributes within the body. These are often small studies, often require an overnight stay in what's called a phase 1 unit at the research center, and are often executed in a few number of sites. Phase 2 is a little bit larger study. It determines the right dosage and effectiveness of a potential medicine. Phase 3 expands on the phase 2 data and determines whether the investigational medicine would be safe and effective for an even wider variety of people. And then phase 4 is a study that's run after a drug has been approved for use. It's sometimes called a post-marketing study, but it's a way to monitor public safety and potential serious adverse events with a newer therapy. In clinical trials that compare a new product or therapy with another that already exists, researchers try to determine if the new one is as good or better than the existing one. In many studies, you actually may be assigned to receive placebo, which is an inactive product that resembles the test product, but without its treatment value. And in those studies, randomization is the process where treatments are assigned to participants by chance rather than choice. And this is done to avoid any bias in assigning volunteers to get one treatment or another. So another good question to ask if you're considering a study that has a placebo arm is, what is the randomization? For example, if for every 3 patients in a study, 2 receive study drug and 1 receives placebo, that's called a 2-to-1 randomization. A key thing to understand about clinical trials are the guidelines that are developed about who can participate in a study. And as we said earlier, clinical trials are scientific experiments, and they are really designed with scientific rigor. And the guidelines are called inclusion-exclusion criteria and outline the factors that allow you to take part in a clinical trial or to be excluded from a clinical trial. The criteria really are used to identify appropriate participants and keep them safe, but also to help ensure that the researchers can find new information they need. So there has to be some sort of even playing field of who can be included so the data can be assessed and really evaluated. Other key terms, you may hear a study may have an open label extension or an OLE. This is a period at the end of a clinical trial where all participants are eligible to receive active treatment for an extended period of time. So if a clinical trial has data that is positive, patients who had previously been on a placebo arm are eligible to receive the active treatment in this OLE extension. So it's often a really good thing to understand if this would be available in a study that you may be considering. And then a registry is an organized system that uses observational study methods to collect uniform data to evaluate specified outcomes for a population defined by a particular condition. So there are a number of registries in the ALS community, and these are really important research studies. They're not evaluating an experimental medicine, but really looking at the experience of living with a condition, and then the experience of over time, how people behave, their condition behaves. And so registry data is really important to advance research. So there are a number of questions to ask when you consider a study. And I think one of the most important is really to dig deep into what is the trial visit schedule and assessment schedule. Some trials may last for years, but only require visits every few months. Others may require far more frequent visits and far more testing like blood draws or bone marrow biopsies or lumbar punctures. And you really want to understand what you're getting into when you commit to a study. As we talked about, knowing if there's a placebo arm or an open label extension, you should and can take the informed consent form home and review it before signing. It's really designed for you to have the most information at your fingertips before you commit. If you choose to join a clinical trial, you're free to leave at any time for any reason, even before the trial is completed. These are really voluntary studies. Some trials also end early if researchers aren't seeing the results they were hoping for, or the opposite. If they see very clear results, they'll stop the trial early. One of the most frustrating things for study participants is communication about the study progress and results may take a while to reach you. There's a very rigorous process to evaluating data, and it happens with a lot of scientific digging deep into the data and assessing the results that takes time. And then there's a period where the data can be communicated publicly. For many pharmaceutical companies, it can impact a lot of public reporting and financial results. And so there's just a lot of pieces in place that have to come together before study results can be reported. And it's often a frustration for people who participate that they don't hear in a timely manner, but there are reasons for that. And I know with patient-focused drug development, pharmaceutical companies are getting a lot better about making sure the patient community is informed about study results as quickly as possible. This is just a really high-level slide that shows the drug development overview. And you can see the time period. We hear a lot about this. There's an early period called drug discovery or preclinical, where candidates are identified to potentially go into human studies. And then the drug development period starts with the phases we talked about earlier for different stages of clinical trials, and then ultimately registration and approval. So the idea for a clinical trial often starts in a lab. And I've been in meetings where people are talking about toxicology results and looking at chemistry combinations and thinking about what and how a new drug might work. And the most promising treatments are then moved into clinical trials. And then the only other thing I wanted to mention, and this has come up a couple times in questions I've had from different community members, but there is another participant in the clinical trial process called a CRO. And CROs are contract research organizations that provide support to pharmaceutical companies and biotech and really manage some of the clinical trial related services. Not every CRO does all of these services, but they can help support a drug study sponsor or pharmaceutical company in executing the clinical study. So sometimes if you, for example, have used a web tool to learn about a study, there's a CRO behind that asking questions and giving you information. And that's one of the roles that they can play. So it's just another sort of player in the space of clinical trials.
Perfect. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the specific ALS study that we're running at Alexion, and before that, talk a little bit about the role of complement and immune dysregulation in ALS. So complement is a key component of the innate immune system. So it's composed of both blood circulating and membrane-bound proteins. And complement works in a cascade manner to augment the immune response. So it would normally, your body uses complement to help rid it of foreign pathogens, and it helps regulate your body's inflammatory response to infection. When the complement system is either underregulated or overactivated, it can lead to unwanted cellular or neuronal death, and that can be observed in multiple neurodegenerative diseases. So diseases like GMG and NMOSD, and also we believe potentially in ALS as well. So this slide shows a very simplistic schematic of the complement activation pathway. There are multiple ways that the complement system can be activated. There is a key component of it that's called C5, and when C5 is activated, it separates into two different parts. One is called C5a, and the other is called C5b, very informative names given to it by scientists. But in any case, C5a is responsible for initiating an inflammation response, and C5b, as part of it forms a complex with a variety of other proteins, and it forms something that you may have heard of called the MAC, or membrane attack complex. And that complex actually forms a hole in cells, which ultimately leads to their death. So again, complement is part of your normal immune system, which would be activated under conditions of infection to help your body rid it of that invading pathogen. Here's some data that shows you why we think that complement might play a role in ALS. And on the left-hand portion of this slide, what you're looking at is, so remember how I told you C5 breaks into these two key components of C5a and C5b. So C5a, if you look at that in the plasma of either normal patients or patients with ALS, you see that there's an increase in C5a levels. Similarly, on the right-hand portion of this slide, you see C5b, which helps initiate the formation of that membrane attack complex I just spoke about, is also increased in ALS patients. So this suggests that that C5 complement activation or dysregulation could play a role in ALS. There aren't a lot of preclinical models of ALS, but there are a few. So they're basically genetic mouse models where animals with very specific mutations get a disease very similar to ALS. And so if you use that model system and you treat those mice with a C5a inhibitor, what you'll see is that those mice that are treated with that inhibitor will survive longer than the animals who get a vehicle control or placebo. So there is some preclinical data to suggest that complement plays potentially a critical role in the initiation of ALS, and based on those data, and based on the fact that complement inhibitors, Soliris and Ultomiris, two Alexion drugs, have shown to provide clinical benefit in other neurodegenerative diseases, Alexion decided to test Ultomiris in ALS in a phase 3 study. So as Wendy was just describing, Phase 3 studies are studies where you're trying to assess both the safety and the efficacy, basically determine the clinical benefit provided by your treatment. So this slide gives you an overview of the CHAMPION ALS study. So this is a phase 3 study, as I just mentioned. It's randomized and placebo-controlled. And I'll give you a little more detail on that in a sec. It's a relatively large study. We're hoping to enroll a total of 354 patients. The study is almost completely enrolled at this point, and screening is actually closed. There are a few screening slots still available, but they've all been allocated at this point. So we've been very successful in enrolling patients quickly to this study. So that's been good. The primary endpoint of the study, so the primary way that we're assessing efficacy in the study is by looking for changes in the ALS functional rating scale, comparing the impact on patients who either receive the placebo versus patients who get Ultomiris or ravulizumab. There are also a variety of other secondary endpoints, which we will look at if we see clinical benefit with the primary endpoint. So you can see that on this slide. We will look at, for example, changes in baseline in the ALS-FRS total score, changes in vital capacity, changes in muscle strength, etc. And of course, these studies always do safety assessments as well. Here's a slide that provides a schematic of the design. So I'll walk you through this slowly so you can understand how the study is designed. So as Wendy just mentioned, this study is randomized and controlled. And so our randomization in this study is 2-to-1. So what that means is there will be a total of 236 patients who will get ravulizumab or Ultomiris, and 118 patients who will get placebo. So for every 3 patients that are enrolled in the study, 2 will get the study drug and 1 will be placed on placebo. We will assess or provide that treatment for a total of 50 weeks, so almost a year. And at the end of that period, we have an open label extension. So all patients, whether they were getting ravulizumab or placebo, will have access to receive ravulizumab for up to 2 years. So the total time of the study is approximately 3 years, if you include the treatment period and the open label extension. And so this slide describes some of the inclusion criteria. So as Wendy also mentioned, there's specific criteria that are applied so that we get a patient population on the study that isn't too heterogeneous. And this makes it easier for us to assess both safety and efficacy in the study. So in this particular study, you need to have an ALS onset of up to 3 years prior to screening. You need to be vaccinated against meningococcal infection, and you need to have a certain level of respiratory function, so a slow vital capacity of 65% or higher. And this slide lists some of the exclusion criteria. So for example, if you are already need help with mechanical ventilation, then you wouldn't be allowed to enroll. If you had previously been treated with a complement inhibitor, whether ours or another company's, then you wouldn't be allowed to enroll, etc. So that at a very high level describes the CHAMPION ALS phase 3 study. So I believe that's my last slide. So I thank you all for your time, and Wendy and I would love to take your questions or explain anything that isn't clear.
Well, thank you first off, Dr. Kuppmerman and Wendy, for coming and presenting. My name is Sarah. I'm part of the Everything ALS team. I am going to be one of the 2 people moderating some questions, so we'll get started right away. When considering joining a clinical trial, what are the top 3 things patients should consider or think about before choosing which one they would potentially want to see if they qualify for?
Eric, do you want me to jump in, or do you?
Yeah, why don't you jump in and then I'll add on.
So I'll answer that question based on a project that I was involved in a couple years ago, where we met with a fairly large number of patients, and it was a mixed group of people who had participated in studies and people who hadn't, research coordinators, as well as advocacy groups. And we were working on a project to develop a clinical trial toolkit. And in that work, that the outcome of that was really understanding the stage of the study. So understanding if it was phase 1, phase 2, or phase 3, and then also knowing how the intervention was expected to work. So as Eric described, the Alexion approach impacts complement, but there are a lot of different ways and mechanisms of actions of drugs. So having an idea of what the hypothesis is and how they expect the drug to work in your body came up as number 2. And then number 3 was really understanding the assessments that would be undertaking in the study. So kind of back to that burden of the actual participation in the clinical trial itself. So in one study, for example, in a pediatric condition, the kids had to be at the hospital by 7 a.m. and had to participate in a 6-minute walk test. And that proved to be a really big burden for the parents to get out the door and get their young child to a study visit by 7 a.m. And there was another clinical trial that in the same disease that didn't require the 6-minute walk test. And that was really attractive to a lot of the parents. So just understanding what the assessments are and the time commitment is another really important thing to know.
And I would just add to what Wendy said. Her second point, let's use maybe a specific example with ALS. As this audience knows, there's familial ALS and sporadic. And depending, for example, if you have familial ALS and are known to have a specific mutation, there might be studies or treatment options that are specifically designed for that mutation. And you might want to look or emphasize participating in a study like that rather than a study that has a drug that has a different mechanism of action. So these are definitely conversations that you should have with your physician when you're thinking about what studies might be the best for you to participate in.
All right, so the next question is, would it be beneficial to also search for trials on patients' own time? What is the necessary information to bring to doctors to have the trials considered?
Yeah, James, I think most of us would agree that any of the research that patients and families can do on their own is only additive. There was a study done not long ago with neurologists, and there was unfortunately a significant portion of them that never offered clinical trials to their patients and didn't initiate the conversation. So I think it is really important for people to know what might be available in their area. And I did see in the chat, someone said that, you know, you could even bring a clinical trial to your doctor and see if you could work with them to get them interested in starting the study. That's a little bit of a complex process. Eric can talk about that more, how study sites are chosen and investigators get involved. But certainly knowing what's available and out there and asking that question is really important.
Yeah, no, thanks. There are a myriad of things that come into play when the team is selecting sites and investigators to participate in a phase 3. Some things are simple as the site or investigator's interest. If a site is already participating in another ALS study, they may not have the capacity to also join or participate in our study. We tend to try and identify the so-called best sites or sites that are centers of excellence, where we know there'll be an opportunity for patients to be referred to that site, and so we get access for patients to enroll in our study. some investigators have a particular interest in the mechanism of action. So some investigators may be very interested in participating in a study where we're using a complement inhibitor like Ultomiris, for example. And then there's also, location has an impact. So for example, in the ALS CHAMPION 5 study, we have 33 sites in the US, so we try and select sites that are dispersed across the US to give both us access to more patients and patients access to sites that are near to where they live.
This kind of goes to the end of the trial process, but what does a manufacturer consider when deciding to do open label extensions for trial participants or expanded access for those who may not qualify for the trial?
Do you want to start, Wendy, on this one?
You go ahead. I think you're probably better equipped.
So for the open label extension component of a study, that's done for a variety of reasons. So one is if Alexion has asked patients to participate in our study, which we're trying to generate evidence that our drug provides clinical benefit, the way to do that from us, to make it sort of scientifically sound, we need to have a control arm and a placebo arm. And so if we've asked patients to participate in our study and to volunteer, we think it's only fair that if they've been placed on the placebo arm, that we give them access to the treatment drug after that treatment period is done. So that's why we have that open label extension component, to make sure that everyone has access to the investigational agent. What was the second part of the question?
Kind of along the same lines, but why would a manufacturer consider expanded access for maybe those that don't qualify?
Exactly. So expanded access programs are often put in place. So as Wendy showed you that very complicated slide that showed you all the different stages of drug development, from the preclinical, going through clinical development to even some post-marketing studies that go on. And it's a very long process. So once we get hopefully the study is successful and we generate data that supports the approval of our drug in ALS, there's a long process where that data is assessed by the health authorities, so the FDA in the United States, the EMA in Europe, PMDA in Japan, et cetera. And that process can take anywhere from 6 months to 18 months. And so you have this long period of time where the data is being assessed. You feel as though the data are good enough to support the filing and the approval, but then patients don't have access to the drug while you're waiting for that assessment to happen. So an EAP allows you to give access to patients in that interim period between the study completion and the actual marketing of the drug, when it'll be widely available to patients.
And then I'll just add to that there are a number of principles associated with expanded access programs. And one is that people who are participating are not eligible for any other clinical study. So the goal really is to assess these drugs in the context of rigorous clinical trials. So expanded access programs may be available, but patients should have exhausted any clinical trial option first.
The next question specifically is, why aren't the changes in the C5 levels used to measure the efficacy of ravulizumab on study participants for endpoints?
That's an excellent question.
Excellent.
So, yeah, so the preclinical data we have suggests that changes in C5 levels will be associated with benefit, but we have to actually prove that in a clinical setting. And so we will and do look at C5 levels in the study participants, but we have to correlate that with an accepted metric of efficacy. And in this particular case, we have an agreement with the FDA that will look at the ALS, FRS, as well as survival overall survival in the study. And so if the study is successful, we may be able to then, if the data are strong enough, to have a correlation between C5 levels and the ALS FRS and or survival. But we have to actually do that study to prove that correlation exists.
Kind of following up on that, in the phase 2 trial, was there any biomarker results that you saw?
So Alexion went directly to a phase 3 study in this case. So there's no phase 1 or phase 2 data.
And I'll expand on that a little bit. We had neurology data for our complement inhibitors in other conditions, which gave us reason to consider studying in ALS. And we had a meeting with a number of physicians, as well as a patient advocacy organization and 2 patients, and really looked at the potential options for clinical trials for this drug, and ultimately decided to go, I'll say, all in on a phase 3, because we wanted to get an answer for the community as fast as possible and not take the community through another phase 2 study that looks really promising, and then you get to phase 3 and it doesn't work. So it really was a commitment on the part of Alexion, with a lot of input from the patient community and the physicians as well.
So was any biomarker data and results come from or you're still in phase 3? So hopefully that'll be looked at and we'll see in the future.
So we are looking at a number of different biomarkers in the phase 3 study, but I don't have any data to share with you at this time. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I'm going to ask this next question in its original format, but because we now understand there's no phase 2, it's going to be changed a little bit. Originally, the question was there any change in the type of patients you admitted in phase 2 versus who qualify for the phase 3 study that you are now enrolling in? So I guess a better question would be, has there been any changes in the types of patients between the phases that you're involved in?
So as you mentioned, there was no phase 2 study done. So the criteria, or the eligibility criteria for the patients that we've included in the phase 3 study has not changed. So maybe I think where this question is coming from, very often you'll see a company will run a phase 2 study, and the purpose of that is to demonstrate efficacy, and then you would move on to a phase 3 study, which is bigger, to confirm that the drug is safe and that it does provide clinical benefit in a larger patient population. And sometimes you'll see in that process of going from phase 2 to phase 3, the patient population that you look at might shift a little bit. For example, you might find in your phase 2 study that there's a certain subset of patients that are more likely to respond or less likely to respond. So you might be more focused on them or exclude them from your phase 3, depending. But we didn't have any of that data. We went directly to phase 3.
Okay. Are you able to explain the differences in mechanisms of action for the Alexion study and the zilucoplan that's on the Healy trial that also focuses on C5?
So they are both C5 inhibitors. And so they have similar mechanisms of action. They're going after basically the same target. There's differences in the PK of the drugs. So when I say PK, that stands for pharmacokinetics. You can think of it as what the body does to the drug. So how it distributes, how it's metabolized, its half-life, so how long it sticks around. Those things can be different, and so that could account for differences in both in safety and efficacy, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Next question.
Sorry, James, I just want to add, there has not been a head-to-head study between the 2 drugs. So we don't really have data that would answer that question, just to be clear.
No, that's true. Yes. Yeah.
I have a very good clarification to point out. The next question is on clinicaltrials.gov. The trial is listed as loading dose for IV, but then it doesn't speak to how often a participant would need ongoing doses. Can you clarify that?
Yeah, so if I can, I'll share my screen again for a second. And hold on, I've got all these.
So go to display settings. No, I'm just kidding.
Here we go. Ugh. I'm sorry. You would think for someone who sits on Zoom meetings all day, I would be better at this. Okay, here we are. Okay, so this gives you some of that information. So the screening process is up to a month. Then you would get randomized to either ravulizumab, Ultomiris, or placebo. That's 50 weeks, and then you have the open label extension. So 2 weeks after the initial loading dose, patients received medication once every 8 weeks. So every 2 months, basically, you come in and you get your dose of drug or placebo.
Perfect.
Kind of based off this slide as well, I know that you said in your presentation the meningococcal vaccine is has to be have had in the last 3 years. Can you explain why that is necessary?
So, as I mentioned at the start of my presentation, complement is part of the normal immune system's response to infection. And so when you inhibit C5, as you do with Ultomiris treatment, you are more susceptible to certain infections. And so you have to be vaccinated against meningococcal infection so that you don't get sick.
Our next question is, what determines when a participant in a trial will be unblinded to know if they are in the treatment arm or the placebo arm?
So, I'm sorry, say that again?
Sure. What determines when a participant in a trial will be unblinded to know if they're in the treatment arm or the placebo arm?
Right. So in the design of studies like this, it's really important. So first, let me make sure that everyone understands what blinded and unblinded is. So blinded means, so this is a double blind study, which means neither the patient or the physician knows who's getting treatment. And the reason we do that is so that the results that we get are unbiased. So you can imagine if you were the patient and you knew you were getting the treatment drug and someone's asking you, well, how do you feel? Do you feel like you can do these activities better or worse? You might be biased to think, oh, I do feel better. I am getting better. I am improving. And that could just be bias. Likewise, the physician, if they knew who was getting treatment or not, they might also be biased in their assessment of the patient. So that's what blinded means. And also, just so that you know, we as the sponsor, so I'm the project leader who leads the ALS program, I am also blinded to the results. So I don't know what patients who have gotten treatment or placebo. So it means that when we're looking at the data, we're not biased about the results. So to answer the question then, so the patients, there's a 50-week treatment portion of the study. So during that portion, and while we're collecting data to assess efficacy, we don't unblind anyone. That reduces the impact of bias on the assessment of the drug. Once that period is done, then we can unblind the patient and tell them you are on the treatment arm or you are on the placebo arm, and then we allow them to join the open label extension if they want to.
I have just another question that came in that corresponds with one really well. So is it necessary to have a placebo in a disease like ALS when there are no viable treatments at this point?
So the short answer is unfortunately yes. In order to definitively prove that our treatment provides clinical benefit, we need to have a placebo-controlled arm. And you know, every company who runs study like this is challenged with the the ethics of this, if you will. But ultimately, if we didn't have a placebo arm, when we brought the data to the health authorities, so say the FDA, they wouldn't be able to, we wouldn't be able to definitively prove that our treatment was providing benefit, and so then the drug wouldn't get approved, and patients wouldn't ultimately have access to it.
If you think about it from the perspective of your 8th grade science class, it really is an experiment, which is, carried out under controlled conditions, and the placebo is that opportunity for control, or in a head-to-head study that compares 2 different therapies. That's a little bit of a different design. I do think we're making progress in the field in that we're limiting the number of placebo participants as much as possible. So statistically, in this study, for every 2 patients who receive investigational drug, 1 patient's on placebo. So study design is really an approach to limit the number of total placebo patients.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. In fact, I was just about to mention that. So we try and design the study in a manner that limits the number of patients who will potentially get placebo, so that the highest number possible of patients are getting the investigational agent.
Thank you for that. Really helps to kind of explain, some of the conflict. And I know for a lot of people on this call, it's hard because, your family members, my case, or the patients themselves are really questioning that. But to understand the safety aspects of it is also important.
Yeah.
Wendy, during your presentation, you talked about phase 4 studies. And the question is, does the FDA always require a phase 4? And if not, what is there? Why is one required, or what would be the reason behind it?
So in my experience, and Erik might actually know, they have always been required in all of the drug development processes that I've been involved in. It's sometimes called post-marketing surveillance. So you'll sometimes see information in the press about post-marketing surveillance, and they really do involve safety surveillance, also called pharmacovigilance, and then ongoing evaluation of a drug after it's received approval in this wider patient population that doesn't necessarily meet the strict clinical trial criteria. So ongoing safety data are collected, and you do start to see if there are any safety signals in a wider population so you can intervene. But Erik, I've never had experience where a phase 4 trial hasn't been conducted.
No, that's accurate. So basically, for example, our ALS study is about 350 patients, and so we will be assessing safety and efficacy. And even though that's a lot of patients, with the health authorities like to see safety assessment with as large a group as possible. So you continue to assess safety even after the drug is approved. Safety and other components of long-term efficacy as well. Yeah.
So kind of in that same line of thought, next question states that your drug development timeline is up to 19 years. Given that the average lifespan is between 3 to 5 years, do you believe there's an obligation to offer expanded access to those who don't qualify?
Who are not eligible for the phase 3 study? Is that
I believe that's what it was in reference to.
Yeah, so sadly, the timelines around drug development are accurate. It can take a very, very long time. And that is partly why, as Wendy mentioned earlier, we didn't run a phase 2 study, because if we had run a phase 2 study, that would have added 3 to 4 years, more years to the development timeline. So the question about early access. So in a disease like ALS, there is a lot of pressure on organizations like Alexion to provide EAPs or other ways that patients can get access to the drug while, like I said, while you're waiting for data to come in or assessing data. And you know, it's a combination of, as Wendy mentioned earlier, you don't want to open up an EAP that would take potential patients away from other investigational drugs or clinical trials until you have evidence of clinical benefit, but you also want to be responsive to the larger community of patients and potentially provide access to some patients who may not be able to enroll in clinical studies. And it's a risk-benefit assessment that every organization does dependent on the data that they have and the disease. I know that's not much of a satisfying answer, but yeah.
And then, James, I saw a couple questions and a comment about the platform study and reducing the placebo arm to 20%. And the platform study is an amazing opportunity in ALS. For those of you who may not be familiar with it, a platform trial has a bigger goal of finding treatment for a disease by investigating multiple treatments at the same time. Yeah. And the reason the placebo arm is 20% of patients in that study is patients enter the platform study and can be randomized to placebo or one of 4 different experimental drugs. So it's just a different trial design. It's also mostly a phase 2 trial design. Really exciting that this is happening in ALS. They're very difficult studies to design. I think that the message I really wanted to share is it's, not moving fast enough, and we need to get an answer to this awful condition much faster, but there's so much exciting research happening right now, and a lot happening for SOD1 and C9orf as well, as Erik mentioned, the familial forms before. So really a time to be optimistic about the clinical research that's happening.
Well said. Thank you, Wendy. This kind of goes back to what we discussed a little earlier, but given that complement impacts our immune system, is it common to find people with ALS who may have other autoimmune disorders before the onset?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if Wendy, if you had any insights to that.
Yeah, Sarah, can you ask that again?
Absolutely. Given that complement impacts our immune system, is it common to find people with ALS who have other autoimmune disorders before the onset of their ALS?
Yeah, and that I don't know. It's funny. If you were asking about some of the other conditions we work in, I have a lot more information, but I don't know about ALS. And so let us do a little digging on our side, and we'll get back to you.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
This one's probably both for Wendy and Erik. Any tips in general for just getting into a clinical trial?
James, it kind of goes back to what I was saying in the beginning, and I feel terrible saying this. And personally, I can give each of you my cell phone number. I'll help any way I can. It takes a lot of advocating on your own. It's a really frustrating, confusing time and process. And my heart just breaks. People call me and say, my doctor put me on your list for your study. And we don't have a list. That's just not how it works. But really staying close to your physician and making sure they're aware of your interest in having information about clinical trials, and then asking them directly about what the process is, either for referral to a trial site. I do find the clinical trial coordinators at trial sites are key people for information and helping navigate the system. And then your advocacy groups are really helpful as well.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Wendy just said. I think the patient advocacy organizations is probably one of the best ways to find out or stay up to date on clinical studies that are either open now, or they probably also know about studies that are going to open soon that may not even be listed yet in clinicaltrials.gov and places like that.
All right. Well, we are going to ask one more question to be respectful of both of your guys' time. But I know there are other questions in the chat, so I will forward them along. And if you have the time, we'd be very gracious to get the answers to a couple of them, because I know people are curious. But this goes back to requiring the meningococcal vaccine. Are you requiring that people get the COVID vaccine, since it also is an immune system issue, or does it potentially make people at risk more for COVID?
Yeah,
so we're not.
Sorry, Eric, I'm just going to answer more broadly. We are running a lot of clinical studies at Alexion, and our approach now, given this is a very dynamic situation and we're learning more every day about COVID and the vaccines, is to follow institutional guidelines. So we're not mandating it for our study at this time, but really to follow what the institution is recommending. The reason for meningococcal is very specific to the complement inhibition mechanism of action of our drug. And we have a very, very long-term safety profile with this drug. So that is required to maintain that long-term safety profile.
No, that's absolutely correct. So no, for the ALS study, we are not requiring a COVID vaccination.
Wonderful. Well, I want to thank you both so much for coming and speaking with us tonight. We got a lot of good information and are excited to see how this, the rest of the phase 3 trial comes to be. Our next part of our presentation is always the open forum where we let everyone unmute and kind of speak. So it's exciting to hear what he has to say. But before we get to that, I want to thank you one more time for both Erik and Wendy for coming and speaking with us, because this has been really informative and definitely answered a lot of questions and made it very clear as to how clinical trials work, as well as the CHAMPION Alexion trial. So thank you very much.
Thank you all for the opportunity to see all of you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thanks.